All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the International Leadership Association's Pause for Pedagogy. This is a conversation with Lisa Endersby on creating an online community practice for leadership educators. And the ILA and I are thrilled to welcome Lisa to our third conversation in the Pause for Pedagogy series. So welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Dan. Happy to be here.
You're welcome. I'm happy to have you here. So a little bit more about Lisa. She is a speaker, an educator, a storyteller, and she explores the intersecting realms of technology, leadership, and assessment in higher education. She's recently begun her doctoral work at the University of Windsor in the area of cognition and learning, and she's investigating professional development in online communities of practice. Lisa is also the national chair for the NASPA Technology Knowledge Community, the TKC, and she enjoys numerous volunteer roles with ACPA and ILA, including service on the planning committee for the ACPA 2016 conference, the first ACPA convention held outside of the United States. So again, welcome, Lisa. So we're going to go through a series of questions about the article that is in the current issue of the Member Connector, the newsletter for ILA members, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. So let's start out with, so what were some of the key questions or kind of the overarching question that you were hoping to answer in writing this article?
Well, I think when I started thinking about this article and thinking about what I would actually be able to contribute to this series, I'm a little bit different than maybe some of the other authors that we've had in the past and some of authors that we may have in the future. While I certainly teach and will consider myself a teacher, I don't often teach in the quote unquote traditional classroom setting. So I don't necessarily teach at the university level yet. I don't necessarily teach in more traditional classroom settings, but I do a lot of teaching and facilitating and training in the realms of professional development and student affairs. And I also do a lot of that work beyond different geographic boundaries. And I use a lot of digital technologies and educational technologies to do that work, in part because one thing Dan didn't mention in my biography, but I mentioned to everyone else, I am not American, I'm Canadian. So I'm very much adding to ILA's mission to be diverse and to be part of the International Leadership Association. But because I'm Canadian and don't live in the States, a lot of the work that I do, while I certainly enjoy visiting my American neighbors, I spend a lot of time doing this sort of work online. So that combination between teaching and learning and training in a different, less traditional setting, along with doing it in an online environment, I've been really interested in exploring those particular intersections, what it actually means to teach and train using online tools, but doing it in a way that's not just teaching and training for students. While it's certainly been an area of interest of mine for a number of years, I've been in student affairs for over 6 years now. And I've run the gauntlet of doing teaching and training for students in all different areas of student affairs. More recently, particularly in the work that you mentioned, Dan, with NASPA, I've really become interested in how to do teaching and training and professional development for staff and faculty. So how we can do our work better, but also recognizing that as much as we are teachers, we are also learners as well. So I've been exploring that work, beginning to explore that work in my doctoral program. But I've also had experience doing that work in communities of practice. So NASPA's Technology Knowledge Community is a community of practice. I also mentioned in the article talking about LEARN, the Leadership Educators and Resource Network, which was the beginning or pilot community of practice for Caucus, which is sort of the, not sort of, it is the Canadian equivalent of NASPA and ACPA, so more acronyms, but on the Canadian side. So I think in this article, what I was really looking to do was think about how do these online communities of practice actually support teaching and learning for professional staff? We talk about them a lot, and there's a lot of literature for how this works for students. There isn't as much, or it hasn't been investigated, in my mind, as completely when we think about working with faculty and staff or administrators. So in part, I'm doing this because it's the beginning of my doctoral work, so I'm exploring this in many different ways. But also just interested in thinking about how do we do that for ourselves when we spend so much time thinking about how we do it for students.
Sure. So when we think about communities of practice and educational contexts, can you tell us a little bit more about kind of the idea of communities of practice in general, and then how it translates virtually or online, if you will, specifically, and kind of how it works for leadership educators as you discussed in your article, and maybe a little bit about where the idea or need for this work came from.
Yeah. So online communities of practice, or communities of practice in general, it's not a new phenomenon, but the naming of it is relatively new. I think for a number of years, and particularly in this profession, as you know too, Dan, higher education, we're very much community focused, particularly in student affairs. We talk about community building all the time. We do icebreakers to death. We love connection and conversation. And we do a lot of that informally. And I'm making a large assumption, but a lot of the people who are attracted to this field are the types of people that crave and appreciate having that sense of community. So communities of practice in part are simply that, they're a community. They're a space for people to come together. A lot of the more recent literature talks about people coming together around a common interest. And that doesn't really sound much different than any other community, any other club that you're a part of, any other affiliation that you have in your community, in your home, or anything like that. The real piece that differentiates these communities from others is the practice piece. So very often we talk about communities of practice as places for knowledge dissemination or knowledge sharing. So Learn, for example, that I talk about in the article, really came about as a way to, one, bring people together under a common interest. So these were leadership educators or people who identify as having a role in leadership education at universities and colleges across Canada. So it initially was, we do something that's in common with a lot of other people. We must have shared interests and shared challenges, and we want to connect around those. So there's opportunity for knowledge dissemination within that community of practice. What's interesting now, though, is some of the research and the writing about communities of practice don't just talk about knowledge dissemination, but they're talking about knowledge generation. So it's actually not just an opportunity to network, if you will, or what we did a lot in Learn was, this is an interesting article, I want to share it with you, but it becomes, this is an interesting article, I want to share it with you, and through our conversations and connections, this actually sparks some interesting ideas where we might want to do further research. Or this is an interesting best practice, I want to use it in my own practice, and now I've developed a different best practice or a new best practice or an offshoot of that particular practice. So the community of practice now has become an opportunity not just to network and to share, but also to actually advance the field, advance knowledge in the field, advance practice in the field, and to critically examine some of the work that we're doing. The online piece is really interesting because just like we've talked about when you talk about community development in general, making it online means the information that you have access to is triple, it's tenfold, it's exponentially more. And the people you have access to is the same. The fun challenge now is the same challenge that you have with online learning. The way that we communicate, how we communicate, when we communicate, how often we choose to, it looks different. And just as instructors are having difficulty thinking about how learning looks online, these types of connections and conversations will also look different online. So we've seen really great advances in access to information, in sharing that information, but how we connect and collaborate, again, just as we do with our students, looks different in an online community of practice. So the same challenges that we have with our students, we're seeing with each other. And it's really interesting to see that online, we now have this really cool opportunity to connect with people who are seemingly much more different than just our smaller circle, where these best practices just get shared and disseminated and they look the same after a while. But now that we get the chance to really break down these geographic barriers, we're seeing influences from other cultures, other communities, other places, other people. And so now the challenge is not just dissemination, but it's also integration. And how do we make things work in different contexts, whether that is online or whether translating something from online into the classroom.
That's great. Yeah, you can, you know, take a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. That concept.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the context is so important, and just how you know, how do you build it, and just that essence of the opportunity to not only collaborate and discuss knowledge, but the knowledge creation. I think that's just such an important you know, continuation of learning communities that perhaps wasn't there before. So as you think about that and kind of the continuation and transgression of this, what were, you know, what are some of the learning outcomes that you've had from engaging in this practice and this research, and how would you perhaps push other educators or others to assess the outcomes of their own communities of practice, and I guess specifically maybe other leadership educators in learning communities?
Well, and some of the words that you use are actually things that we're still grappling with a little bit. And side note to ILA members, Dan and I have been talking about this a lot in some of our other writing projects. But the leadership piece in communities of practice is actually quite fascinating. And there are lots of really interesting intersections, not just for leadership educators, but educators in general, because communities, as much as you think about more flattened hierarchies or distributed leadership, there's always someone or someones who need to take charge of this particular community. Just like any other community, any other classroom, there needs to be some sort of leader or someone who's keeping this community alive and going. If not, it becomes nothing more than what we've seen in some cases, just a repository of information, which again is still very valuable, but it's not a community of practice.
Right.
So initially, some of the outcomes I found, I was really trying to build initially the community side of communities of practice. So Caucus's initiative, which I think was also NASPA's, some of their priorities were really around member engagement and bringing people together. So the community of practice, again, it's kind of chicken and egg. You start with people who are interested in working with each other, and the practice piece sort of follows from that. But the main impetus for Caucus when I did work with Learn was really how do we engage our members? And one really easy, if you will, way to do that is to connect people with a common interest. So the learning outcome really was, are they engaged with each other? Are they networking? Do they feel a part of the community? So all the things we talk about in student affairs, going all the way back to Aston and Tinto, social integration, is there a way for people to actually connect with each other and feel like they're engaged in something, feeling like they have a support system, if you will, in some cases, because professional associations are that amongst the many other things that they are. They want to be a support to their members, and this is a way to do that, while also connecting them to other people with common interests, which is, of course, another goal of professional associations. So initially, a lot of my learning outcomes were around the community aspect. Do they feel engaged? Do they feel connected? And are they talking about things that are relevant to their profession? And again, that started from the community piece, because if they're not engaged, they're not going to talk. So it doesn't matter, how many articles we share with them. It doesn't matter what information we put on the website. If they're not engaged with each other, if they don't feel like they're a part of a community, those types of conversations may not necessarily happen. But then we found, and what I've been finding, which is the impetus for a lot of my doctoral work, is the practice piece. So when you talked about assessment, that's also, of course, a big area of interest of mine. I've done a lot of assessment consulting over the years, thinking about learning outcomes, not just in the digital space, but learning outcomes related to professional development or any sort of training opportunity. And what's interesting in communities of practice is, again, we talk about practice as a community, but it's hard to tell how and what and how well the community is practicing. And what I mean by that is it's really hard to assess skill development in a community of practice, even though skill development, knowledge generation, those sorts of things may be one of your goals. So I'll use the TKC, the Technology Knowledge Community, as an example. I would love to know that my members, or some of my members, a subset of my members, have developed or increase their competency in technology. I have no idea right now if that's happening. I have no good way of testing that or assessing that. I also have no good way of actually, what's the word I'm looking for, of actually making sure that that happens. We haven't necessarily created events or opportunities or trainings where that's happened. We have a couple of webinars. We're working on some online course content, which will hopefully have a good assessment component to it. But in this larger community of practice, how do we know professional development is actually happening? Have we actually created space for skill development to happen? And I intentionally said technology competency because now we have competencies like the technology competency with ACPA and NASPA, where we've got rubrics and we have ways that people can actually move from more foundational stages through to advanced stages. But again, in these communities, particularly in online communities that are so big and diverse and their activities are so spread out, how do we know that that professional development piece is happening? So the learning outcomes initially were always around community, again, engagement, integration, support, social networking. But the learning and the actual practice is much more difficult to measure. So what I talk about in the article is you can create spaces that are learner-centered and teaching-centered, but the assessment-centered piece is harder because you can really only assess what you can see. That's one of my favorite idioms when I talk to people about assessment. You can only assess what you can see, which is the greatest opportunity as well as the greatest challenge online. So we can assess that, yes, they're engaged online, but can we assess that they're learning something, and can we assess that they're developing as a professional? Not unless you fly me to every major American city, which if anyone's willing to do that, I'll go, to actually be in the classroom or be in the office or be where they are with students to see if they're actually practicing what they're learning in this online community. And then there are also fun intersections of social learning, which I talk about a little bit, and I've started talking about in my doctoral work too. Learning in a social environment looks different, particularly in an online community. So lots of fun intersections, but the goal really is to think about, is the community of practice impacting your practice, not just impacting you as feeling as an engaged member of a community. So I don't have the answers yet. I might in about 4 years-ish, but I think that's the tougher learning outcome. But the learning outcomes around community are still absolutely valuable and still absolutely important to the work that we're doing.
Great. No, perfect, and a perfect segue to our last set of questions here.
Yeah.
Have me thinking about, it's certainly, you think about like Facebook analytics or Google analytics, you can see how many people have accessed a learning community, for example, or how many likes, or, how many people have rated posts or have logged in and things like that. But the actual qualitative piece is going to be more challenging to evaluate. And, that makes me think about, where do you see the future research or writing headed in this area? What will you be writing about next, in general or associated with this, and anything else you'd like to share with us?
Well, if you ask my PhD supervisor, I'll be writing a lot about it in the next couple of years. I think what I'd love to see again is really digging a little bit deeper into these intersections that I was alluding to in my last answer. So we talk about communities of practice, and we talk about social learning, and we talk about professional development, and we talk about online communities. And I'm quite ambitiously trying to pull a lot of those things together into my doctoral work and into the work I'll be doing over the next couple of years. And I very intentionally wanted to focus on online communities of practice. So there are, of course, communities of practice that exist probably at your institution, at my institution, people who get together. I remember one assessment consulting opportunity that I had was, being a guest speaker they do a brown bag lunch series. That can very well be a community of practice, people coming together to talk about a shared interest around assessment, and we did some professional development and learning. So it can happen in person, of course, as well. But the push these days, of course, with different learning technologies and professional associations that have members across the globe, the goal really is to do something online. So I'm looking at, how do online communities of practice impact professional development when you think about ways that online tools, digital tools, impact learning and development already. And now you're also trying to think about community online as well. So it's almost like these two big pots that I'm trying to put together. There's online community and online professional development, and now they're happening together. Also, I think what's a fun challenge is thinking about what professional development really looks like. I explored this very, very briefly, a paragraph's worth in my first PhD assignment a couple months ago, just thinking about, what does professional development actually look like? Because of course there's professional development on the skill development side, but there's also a piece of professional development that relates to, again, back to community building, personal development. We want people to grow not just as professionals, but as people. And of course, in a way that's not necessarily a bad thing, institutions invest in professional development because they're investing in people and they want them to stay. So there's also that piece around the community. Institutionally, it's good for the community. So how do you make sure that the work that you're doing actually impacts not just the person, but impacts the whole community and impacts the institution? So lots of stakeholders involved too. So it might be interesting as a research direction to think about what online communities of practice look like from different perspectives and what people think those priorities are. Because I'm also narrowing my research because that's what my PhD supervisor told me to do. I was way out here. I'm trying to do this. I just talked about how ambitious it is, but I'm trying to do this. The other thing we talked a lot about was where these online communities of practice exist. So I'm also intentionally looking at online communities of practice that are part of the suite of services, if you will, in professional associations. So not looking at ones through institutions, but looking at ones through professional associations, because again, one of the biggest parts of their mission, in my mind, is professional development. So what does that mean when it's an online community of practice that's funded by and pushed by an organization that has a goal and a mission around professional development, whose very existence sometimes depends on quality professional development and having resources behind it? So what does it look like when it's got someone like me who does that work, but also people who are paid to actually oversee the knowledge communities, for example, in NASPA? There are people, with knowledge communities right in their title in NASPA, and that's their job, to oversee logistically as well as from a development standpoint, the ongoing growth of these communities of practice. So my research, I think, will focus more on the practice side, but I can't ignore the community piece either, because social learning, again, is such a huge portion. So I'd love to see concurrent research happening around social learning, what that looks like. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to think about it, not just from students, not just from the student perspective. As much as I love students, and I still do, and I still work with them every day, I'm really seeing from my own career interests and my research interests how this happens for people like us.
Right.
And there's lots of documentation around and lots of research around what it means for students. But I think we're really only scratching the surface around what it means for us as students. And we talk about, anecdotally seeing ourselves as students, but now we really are. And so what does it mean for us to grow as professionals with this seemingly new and hot trend in online communities of practice? So lots to be done, lots of areas to focus on, and I'm just trying to amalgamate them into something that's going to get me a doctorate in a few years.
And that's one of my favorite words, amalgamate. So
amalgamate. I know. I was started doing the, integrate, synergy. Yeah.
So, I mean, online communities they've come so far, but there's that leader-follower relationship that has to occur, and the facilitation of it is just part of the challenge. With you talk about engagement and levels of engagement, and how do you even define professional development and these other social constructs, so that in some ways that's a tall task for our ILA staff. They've got their ILA Intersections community that was recently unveiled in the last couple months here, and curious to see how that's taken off. They've had a lot of engagement, but again, how much do they know, and have they thought about some of these things? And a lot of this is going to be created over the next couple of years by scholars like you. So,
well, and just to say, I mean, to bring it back to what we've been talking about in the actual purpose of this series, the pedagogy in and of itself also looks very different. Sure. The curriculum that you try to share and the way you assess that curriculum will have to look very different online, particularly with a lot of these communities of practice. And the TKC is no exception. Learn was no exception. A lot of it is member driven. Mm-hmm. So a very different model than, I am the teacher in the classroom and I am giving you this curriculum. I am sort of in control of this pedagogy. The whole point of an online community of practice is that the pedagogy sort of happens organically. And that's just as fascinating as it is frightening, to think about that you have this community that will teach each other and will bring their own pedagogical styles and their own teaching styles into this mix of conversation. So as much as you may have a curriculum in mind, again, even just logistical considerations, like I do the TKC off the side of my desk. It's not my paid full-time role. And same with some of the things that happen in ILA, some of the things that happen in caucus. So as much as you try to push it forward, there are even just practical implications for why pedagogy and curriculum are going to look different. So that's going to be really fascinating to watch too. Can you create, a purely online pedagogy and curriculum for a community of practice through a professional association?
Right. How do you facilitate emergence?
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome.
Synergistic emergence. Yes.
Synergistic amalgamation of emergence.
There you go.
No. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to have you. And the Pause for Pedagogy, it's an initiative of the Leadership Education Member Interest Group of the International Leadership Association. And our articles and videos are available online at www.ila-net.org. And you can follow the association on Twitter at @the_ILA. Again, thanks so much, Lisa. Have a good one.
Thanks, Dan.